Okay, hello, and welcome to episode 10 of The Point with me, your host, Jeff Spikes. Episode 10. It's a good round number. The fact that we've got 10 episodes going, I'm not checking a lot of stats, but I've been told that we're doing well. For however many episodes it is that we're on. I think that was on episode 8. I was told, wow, man, we're doing well. Maybe it was 7, but it was, I had an X amount of downloads and all that stuff. And I'll tell you, I'm not really doing it for that. I'm doing this podcast to keep myself creating and talking and expressing what I need to express, because it keeps me on target with things that help me support my clients. And it keeps me in a place with myself of consistent action of putting a message out and getting feedback on what that is so that I can improve my craft. It's also helps support the idea of content and having some type of thread of synchronicity throughout the various programs that we run in the firm and the corporate work that we do, and also a lot of the benefit type work that we do. So it kind of brings everything together for me. Now, that being said, as someone who's practiced strengths, I'll tell you, as far as my processing, I am a verbal processor is my number one way. My second most common or preferred way of processing, the way I naturally process and flow, is verbally, intuitively, is the other. So it helps me to talk things out, and then I hear things and intuitively end up feeling and knowing things from that really help me. So that's me. And that's why I'm here, and that's why I'm working in this podcast, why I've created this podcast. Not only that, I want to put it more out there so I can find more like-minded people and create some energy to move forward with, just to be around like-minded people, wherever they are on the road, in the journey, and however we want to judge that. Gathering more like-minded people to, I think it's when each one of us does something that's rare or difficult, whether it's overcoming trauma of a certain kind or reaching an unattainable goal. It's like threading a needle, it's like putting a thread, it's threading a needle. So through the eye of the needle, it's difficult to get through there, but once it's through there, the rest of the needle comes easy. So, the most famous story I can think of with that is the 4-minute mile. As soon as one person did it, all kinds of people were doing it. So we're all doing that every day when we're doing things that aren't common to us, when we're stretching ourselves, when we're doing something a little bit better than we did the day before. We're making it easier for someone else that also hasn't done that. And I'm telling you, somebody's always watching you. There's always somebody watching you. Maybe not always. I don't mean that conspiracy theory wise. I mean, in our lives, there's people that are always watching us. And we never know when somebody sees something that makes an impact and that helps them. We rarely get the feedback that something's good. It's more common to get feedback when something's not so good. But when we work on just being the best that we can be and optimizing everything that we do, it's a hell of a lot better journey. And I think that, let's get to the point now, because that's what this is the point. This is part 3 of a 3-part series that's really about motivation and belief. We started with motivation, talking specifically about motivation and how belief systems and values and standards really affect our motivation, that motivation is really a symptom. The lack of motivation is a symptom, but healthy, positive motivation is a result of a way of living and a way of thinking and a way of demonstrating positive self-love and self-compassion. So when we find things that we're passionate about and we focus on those things and then look for the best of ourselves, motivation can become much simpler and easier. So That being said, we're going to jump right into it. On episode 2, we started talking about how not believing something doesn't make it not true. Okay? Not believing something doesn't make it not true. Well, this week, we're going to talk about how believing something, just because we believe something, doesn't make it true. So because there's a lot of things that we believe. My favorite example, and when I draw clusters on a board, and I put a value, a circle with a, and that's the value, and then I put other circles with circles off of that, and it looks like a solar system or something, or it looks like cell structure of something. We call that a cluster, and there's values, and around the values there's beliefs, and around each belief there's stories, and in the center of the value, in the center of all that's our identity. So we have our identity, and then we have these values, and the values are surrounded by beliefs, and those beliefs are protected by stories. My favorite story, just because we believe something doesn't mean it's true, has to do with tobacco. And I grew up in a time where I was born in the end of the era when doctors were still recommending Camels, which is a brand of cigarettes. And I say that kind of facetiously, but doctors were recommending now and some others that were super low in tar and everything else. But I was born in the era when that was all ending, and I was a young adult when the campaigns really kicked in high gear to get people to quit smoking. I was in my 20s and 30s as we put just tons of money and advertising into anti-smoking campaigns. And we were trying to, globally, we were working, or maybe in the United States, we were working on this mission of getting people to stop smoking. We weren't focused on a whole lot of other things that were hurting us as a whole, but we were focusing on tobacco. Well, the value and the beliefs and the stories, just because we believe something doesn't mean it's true, is we would believe that it wasn't hurting us to smoke. And our evidence, the stories for that, was that there's someone that was 92 years old that was smoking still, that was doing just fine. There was somebody 40 years old that never smoked that died. And we'd tie that into it. People got tired of hearing, people that smoked got tired of hearing these campaigns come at them, and they felt attacked, and they felt, all these things. Now, a lot of people quit. It was a very successful strategy. It was a very successful campaign. And over the years, tobacco is much less common or popular in the U.S. It's still, if you look at the numbers of how much of it's still selling like crazy, but you're not going to find it on the airplanes. I actually have photographs from a plane I was just in, was flying commercial, and I was in the bathroom, and I think it was an old U.S. Air plane, U.S. Airways plane that American Airlines had bought. And it still had ashtrays in the bathroom and got all the signs for not smoking and where to put your cigarettes or not put your cigarettes, which made me laugh. I took pictures of it. I'll probably throw something up and just talk about change in social media at some point. But okay, so back to this idea that believing something doesn't mean it's true. When we think about the tobacco thing, the belief was that I can smoke and I'll be just fine. It's not doing all that to me. And so we could show someone a black lung. We could we could even show a real lung of a smoker and show how black it was and how diseased it was. And there were so many stories and beliefs that it protected the smoker from seeing that information or from taking that information in. They were so protected that they never saw it and never touched their identity, and they continued to smoke. Now, there were other stories than the people who died and didn't die and all that stuff. And there was also the stories of how it was just propaganda and people trying to control us and whatever. But it doesn't mean that smoking tobacco doesn't cause problems in our bodies. And it doesn't mean that we have clear lungs. And now at the same time, if we believe in healing, we believe in manifesting. We were just talking about this. We were just talking about this, significant out of this world view of looking at a timeline of 200 plus years and looking at this idea of how time has changed on our view of how we can heal ourselves. And at one point it was a foo-foo-y cult that people only really believed if they had the experience. And now people are running for the experience because they're seeing on paper in documentation how it works in our minds and our bodies and what the statistics are that show when taught a certain way to put our bodies and our minds in a certain state, we're demonstrating and proving that our bodies heal. So we're putting more science and more data towards successful healing to show what that looks like, which increases the number of people that can access it because it increases the teacher's ability to work with someone and see the shifts and changes to help be specifically adapted to that individual and help them get where they want to go. And we're all using the same tools. That's one of the things that I think is really common and interesting to talk about. We're still using the same tools of gratitude, of envisioning, of practicing different thoughts and behaviors, of focusing our attention and calming ourselves and getting ourselves into somewhat of a meditative or hypnotic trance state where we can receive information better. We certainly use gratitude because gratitude is that intense receiving state. So now that we know all this stuff, I sometimes wonder, why aren't more people doing it? Why aren't more people running at it? And I guess sometimes for a lot of people, certain things are just good enough. They're fine the way they are. And I can't challenge that. They're fine the way they are. They're fine the way they are. But let's get into these two things of this next segment here about what this looks like and this idea of what belief does and how it affects our motivation. This one, we're going to talk about this encouragement to seek common ground everywhere we go. To seek common ground, not so that we don't have to see the differences, not to avoid any realities or truths or facts of anything else, just seek common ground so we have something to focus on that centers us, that connects us, and that gives us some kind of a foundation of health and connection and positive. So specifically look for it. It's too easy to see the critical, to see what's not right. It's way too easy. Our critical mind doesn't have enough work to do. We've talked about that. There's not enough fight, fright, or flight things happening that we start fabricating them and crafting them. So give our critical mind something to do, and that's all well and good. It's going to do something anyway. It's easy to find what's wrong and what's broken. What it takes intention to do is stop and make specific energy and time, take specific work, put specific energy towards finding common ground, something you can agree with. No matter where we are, if it's in a culture, we may go visit a foreign country. We may not agree with certain things that we see. We may not agree with practices. There might be things that we don't even not agree with. We don't understand. And you go down into South America or Mexico for Day of the Dead and start seeing that. And if you've never been exposed to it, it could really be freaky. It could really be intense if you've never been exposed to anything like that. And you might wonder what it's all about. It might look kind of scary. Well, dig into the culture and learn about it. It can be a beautiful ceremony. So a beautiful celebration. So one of the things I like to do here is find common ground everywhere. And then there's that little caveat of except where we shouldn't. And I want to take 1 minute to talk about absolute statements, because there's always an exception to the rule. So there are certain things that we're going to want to distance ourselves from, and we don't want to, for our own emotional framework, we're going to make choices not to try and find common ground. And I just want to acknowledge that and be clear about that. I'm really serious about affecting change in some areas, and I have friends that have gone out and been part of these. They're not posses, but part of, for lack of a better word, the posses that are going out and trapping people committing crimes against children, whether it's trafficking or if it's other types of crimes. And I'm saying there's some areas where we just need to put our foot down and do the right thing. And there's no room to find common ground with anybody in these situations. I will say that is how they're trapped sometimes, is by finding the common ground and hooking them with something that they want. So maybe there's still something to it, but that's not what we're talking about, is my point. We're not on that framework here. If there's something that you just clearly believe is wrong and you don't want to have common ground with, so everywhere is not everywhere. So let's talk about this absolute statements. I love them. Like, I never do that, well, except for when I do, right? I always sleep with a sheet. Well, except for when I don't. Except for when it's really cold. But I live in Arizona, so when do I need anything other than a sheet, right? So what's my point there? There's a lot of more comical scenarios of what some of us might say that, I never do that. I never do that. Well, except for when I do. There's always an exception to the rule. And I think that's okay. We still want to look for that. We still want to look for something we agree with rather than disagree with, so that we have that as common ground if we're trying to maintain relationships and if we're wanting to learn more. Because just because somebody comes from a different viewpoint doesn't mean they're wrong, and just because they come from the same viewpoint doesn't mean they're right. And if we don't start removing ourselves from some of the arguments that can't be won, there's some discrepancies or differences or opinions that we can't change. Only the individual can change. And all we can do is change ourselves. So starting to look at, when we start looking at the serenity prayer, God grant, and I'll just say the we version, grant us the serenity. And maybe it's more personal to do the me, but either way, God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. So the wisdom to know the difference, that's deep. The other two are great as well. I'm not saying any one of those three statements is better than the other, but think about that. The wisdom to know the difference. If we haven't found a common ground, there's no difference. So we can be really thrown off. So find something in common if you're trying to build a bridge. So I've seen cattle ranchers and vegans come together and find common ground because they both love the earth and they both want to see everything beautiful and restored and healthy in our planet. And they didn't focus on anything that they didn't agree with. They didn't focus on the fact that one was raising cattle and the other believed in not doing that. And all of the arguments around that didn't have to be acknowledged, and they were able to move forward pretty powerfully on how to protect an area, and they were able to gain understanding in each other's perspectives, not just in the perspective of where they were coming from emotionally and mentally, but also in their perspective of what it was they were trying to protect and why it made sense. Now, here's another situation where both people can be right in meaning the same thing. And both people can be right in saying something entirely different. So I've volunteered for many years with a ranch, and I've watched them make decisions of when to protect a certain part of the earth from the cattle because a certain type of vegetation needed to be given space to grow and heal, and it was having issues. Whether it was because of the cattle or not because of the cattle, we didn't get it. I don't know. but I know that they went to great lengths to protect certain areas, and they do plant counts and all kinds of things. They're running the ranch under the guidelines and the methods that they use being learned from Holistic Management International. So that's a whole nother topic. But talk about polarized views, eating beef and vegan. Now, that's a whole nother thing about beliefs and what we believe is true, because buying beef from the typical supply chain that's pumping into the Walmart or wherever, that's coming through whatever feedlot in whatever land of, where it is, where a lot of these terrible photos have been done about how animals are treated, is one thing. Coming through a supply chain of locally raised meat where somebody is doing animal husbandry. They're caring for these animals from the moment they're born to the time that they go. I'm going to make a bold statement here. I'm going to talk about something for a minute, because this is something that's just passionate to my heart. And this is another thing that's really relative to this large time frame of what happens with our beliefs and what's true or what isn't true. And I've spoken to people that are vegans that were open enough to hear this in a thought process of what is gratitude and how it affects us. If we go back to the days where we were raising our own crops, we were raising animals for food, we were raising we had, if we had a milk cow, you were rich. If you had chickens and they were laying eggs, that was abundance. If you had a crop that was being tended to and you were able to tend to it, you were fortunate, and you were able to then harvest that crop and trade or make money or do whatever to take care of yourself, and make whatever things needed to be made. And back in those days, saying grace at dinner was an entirely different experience, because when you raise an animal with the understanding that it's going to sustain you through a winter, and you sit down at a table having butchered it and kept it and now having it sustain you, eating it, it's an entirely different level of gratitude to express within a family or a group of people when they share in that food. It's an entirely different level of respect that goes to the animal when you try and use every single part of that animal out of love and respect and compassion. It changes the idea and picture of what grace is altogether. So I don't wonder why grace isn't as common at dinner. Grace at dinner is much more of a religious practice now, not so much a practice of thank God for the food and the hands that helped bring it and the weather and the energy and everything that brought it. Thank God for that food and for the sustenance and that we get to live. So when you're trying to feed anyone that has kids, that's tried to feed their kids and been hungry and been struggling, knows. When I started out my journey, I was with the love of my life at the time, the mother of my children, and we had our first child, and a couple things had happened, and we were in a bad way, and we were staying in a place we couldn't afford, and without getting into all the detail, we were struggling. And I had scraped together all the change I could find, because that's all I had in money. I scraped together all the change after paying all the bills. We just had change laying around the house, and we scraped it together. And I put my daughter on a chest pack, and we walked to a little cafe. And we walked into that cafe and stood at the bar of the breakfast cafe. It was a Saturday morning, I think. And we bought a cup of coffee because that's all we had the money for. And we stood there sharing a cup of coffee. We both drank black coffee and talked about what a dream it would be to eat breakfast. To walk in that restaurant and afford breakfast was a dream. And I'll never forget the first time it happened. I kind of regretted that it wasn't that restaurant, but it wasn't. It was another one that we ate breakfast in finally. But the day that we could afford breakfast without any thought or pain or worry about where the mortgage was coming from, the bills were coming from, was a beautiful day. That back then it was rent. So those are some beautiful times. But anyone that's come from that place that's had to feed their children really, really scratch and figure out how to feed their children understands the value of whatever comes across their table. But we're not all that attached to that anymore because we're not attached to the supply chain the same way we were. Now we're attached to it through videos that only show one isolated part of it, and it affects us emotionally, and now we're not going to eat anything. And we're being controlled by propaganda and by people. It doesn't mean that anyone's wrong in what they're thinking. It just means let's take time to look at what the information is that we're making decisions by, and let's figure out answers. Let's go a little bit further than just that first response. When something brings us tension, my belief is that if something comes in here and becomes tension, and I get taught, twisted, that's a signal. So emotions are a delivery mechanism. That's delivering a message to me that there's something to unwind or unwrap or loosen that can bring change into my life and offer more ease and flow and help me be more flexible. And when we're more flexible, we can much more easily get to where we're going, get what we want out of life. So it's important to build those bonds and to look for those common ground so that as we need those to stay connected to people, we can. The more we focus on, the more they grow. So if it's true that what we focus on grows, then the more we focus on the things that we have in common, the more things we'll find that we have in common. And potentially, we will grow to a place where we're in better agreement with everything, even the things that we think are different. So next little part is about healing our relationships, which I already started to cover. Healing our relationships with everything that we come in contact with. Healing our relationships with the food that we eat. Pardon me. I believe in starting, and I work with my clients to start with what you can control. If it's an individual, we control what we watch, what we say to ourselves, what we say out loud, what we listen to, what we consume, eating or drinking, how we move our bodies, our self-care, whether it's haircuts and showers and massages, all those things that we can control. We focus on that stuff first. So we focus on what we can control and see what we can heal and solve and deal with there first. Challenge the beliefs, start learning to self-query on everything that we're doing and become optimal in all of those areas. So healing our relationship first with ourselves by healing the things we have a relationship to that we can control. Another way to look at that is things that we don't have the ability to delegate. You can't delegate steps. You can't delegate crunches. And I guess you could go tell someone else to do them, but it's not going to help you. So I was listening to something from Sadhguru the other morning, and he was talking about yoga and how the only problem, there's a terrible thing about yoga, and the thing about yoga that's terrible is that you're the only one that can do it. And I cracked up because I say that all the time. Let's focus on what we can control. So we start by healing the relationships we have with ourselves and the things that we can control with ourselves. Then we step out by finding the things that we have in common with. We begin to look at what we have in common and allow that to grow by starting to heal our relationship with others. And we can start with the relationships that are positive and look at healing those. Because I don't know about you guys, but everybody, I mean myself for sure, the people I've brought the most harm to in my life are the people that are the closest to me because they're the ones I feel safest with to let my guard down and make mistakes. And that hurts their feelings. And then I get to stand accountable. So we tend to hurt people closest to us. Hopefully, we're not in a cycle of doing that where it becomes a problem. But we start by healing the relationships that are with ourselves and to the things in our life, and then and as we do that, we start healing. There's this beautiful, amazing, mind-blowing ability that comes to love others, to find compassion for others when we've done that for ourselves. And everything, I put money on it, that most things that you think will happen, if you're sitting in a place of having really learned to demonstrate love and compassion to yourself on a regular basis, whether you're feeling it or not, will create more humility and a greater ability to understand and be non-judgmental, and to just be compassionate towards others. Even if you don't want to connect with them and make friends with them, you'll be more compassionate and maybe give a little bit more grace and understanding when you've learned to do it for yourself. Because it's not easy to maintain a positive attitude all the time. So when you see someone else doing it, instead of looking at it like, oh, well, aren't they on the high horse, you begin to understand that that's probably not easy for them to stay there, just like it's not easy for you or anyone else. We make it easy by automating it. We make it natural. It's not about being easy. We make it natural. And that still doesn't mean that we don't get challenged with things that catch us sideways, that we go, oh, I didn't even realize I was doing that. So just because we believe something doesn't mean it's true. We need to be open to considering new information. The world has changed so fast. And here's the final point I really want to make. All of this information, whether it's NLP, hypnosis, there's all kinds of forms of hypnosis. Hypnotherapy's becoming big again, in my view. I've seen a lot more people talking about hypnotherapy. All these tools we have to help people, if it's NLP, whether it's religious sciences, whether it's science of mind or anything else, we have this basic reality that hasn't changed. And that is that there is a way of thinking and speaking and behaving that puts our bodies into optimal zones where it can heal better. And there's ways to keep our mind, and it starts making all of our parts work better. And the chemicals on our brain work better. We can affect the reduction of depression. We can greatly we can make an effect on so many different issues that are out there that people are suffering from and struggling from. We can help people understand that we don't have to be a culture of sufferers. This hero's journey that we have to have overcome some major thing to be successful or be great is absolutely not true. And there's many people proving that. I'm not one of them, because I had to go through a bunch of crap, and I ended up creating more because of those stories. So I have overcome a lot of obstacles, but I have plenty of people that I know today that they have a hero's journey or they don't, but they're stepping into being helpful and being successful, and that's a beautiful thing. Doesn't mean they're not challenged along the way, but I guess the point I'm making, there's no competition to have had a larger problem that then could make us more successful. That's not the point. That's missing the point. So we don't have to suffer. We don't have to be a people of suffering anymore. We can look at the world from a place of understanding and compassion and look for the feedback it's bringing us so that we can ask the right questions and make the changes we need to make to feel better. So I'm going to tell you one other thing on this. A couple of the funny things that people agree with, and this is kind of like the bomb drop that I want to just stop this on, is that matter's not real and evil's not real. If you go back through at least the last few hundred years and look at a lot of these different different venues or religions or thought processes that brought up new thought, and that's looking at the science today, they're going to say that matter is malleable, and there's this belief that these other things, they're constructs that we've made up. And that's something to discover further. Now, I'm gonna end it here and just talk about designing your strengths, because all of this ties back into designing your strengths. And I fell off of that a little bit here and just diving straight into this practice. I didn't go at all into the book that I wanted to, or talking about Emma Curtis Hopkins, but maybe we'll save that for another day. This is not a religious podcast. This isn't. We're about the point, getting to the point of stuff. And what I'm really about, and what my coaching firm is all about, is talking about that point. There's another point thing, where a projection meets a perception. So I'm communicating something, I'm projecting it. Somebody is receiving it and perceiving it. So where projection meets perception, we want to focus on making those moments worthwhile, making them impactful, and really getting to the point of the most powerful moment that we can have in those times. We want to say the things we mean, not from a perspective of how we need to say them, but that's a consideration. We also want to consider how it's being heard. And we do that quite naturally in some circles. We do that quite naturally when we're meeting with people that are foreign to us, people from other parts of the world or other cultures or other religions or whatever. There's certain traditions that are offensive to one than the other. So we learn those things and try and do the right thing so we don't at least piss each other off. So we do that quite naturally in some ways and not so naturally in others, but that's something that we can really do. And that's just right back to finding the things that we have in common. So we're not religious. We're focusing on these moments and how we can maximize all of those moments, learn to leave people better than we found them, including ourselves, and find that innate special part of who we are, just like everyone else. So we're finding that innately special part of us, because we all have it. And yet that's one of those dual ideas that both can mean that, it sounds like they're totally saying something totally different, but we're actually saying the same thing. Everybody has something beautiful and special about them, which makes us not so special and very special at the same time. So think about that and hit me up with comments. If you're already in the designing process, I'm having this brainstorm right now that we should do a side group one day and dig into some of these theories deeper. But there's other groups for that too. So I appreciate everyone that's been here listening, and we'll see you next week when I start a new series. Thank you for joining us for another amazing episode of The Point with me, Jeff Spikes. The greatest compliment you could give me is liking, loving, and sharing this episode with all your friends. So please, if you're on Spotify, iHeart, or iTunes, leave a 5-star rating and review. If you're on YouTube, like and subscribe. Make sure to tag me. I love hearing from you, the listeners of this show. The links for all my social and iTunes are in the show notes. Also, if you'd like to engage with me in anything related to my coaching, consulting, speaking, or programs, please visit jeffspikes.com for everything you would need to know to engage with me offline. And lastly, thank you for your time, your attention, and your consideration. This is The Point.